I want to introduce you to a deranged man. A scary man. A man who has done things in the Pokemon TCG we have never ever seen before. From single-handedly creating the worst time to ever play Pokemon, a format so bad Pokemon themselves had to step in, to creating one of the most powerful cards of all time that we still see get reprinted to this very day. This is the story of the most unhinged man in Pokemon TCG history. It all starts with his very first card, all the way back in Flash Fire, and boy oh boy does it set the mood. Lysandre was a supporter card that's let you swap out your opponent's active with one of their benched Pokemon. This might seem like a normal card now, but back in 2014, this was revolutionary. You see, back before Flash Fire was printed, we had Pokemon Catcher, which just let you swap your opponent's active with one of their benched Pokemon. On an item card too. This led to Pokemon Catcher being a solid 4 of in every deck, and it made cards like Skylar be an absolute must play, since Skylar was essentially a boss's orders too. This led to a very aggressive format, where games were decided very fast. Creatures realised this was probably a little bit too good, so they errated Pokemon Catcher and all previous prints of it to now require a coin flip to work. And while this did fix the problem of Pokemon Catcher, it also created another huge problem: limited ways to interact with your opponent's bench. You see, only having access to swap your opponent's active 50% of the time via Pokemon Catcher was ludicrous. Genesect DX's red signal would work, but it also required a plasma energy, and that further drove a wedge between the top decks of the format and the lesser decks. Although Lysandre came swinging in to fix that in Flash Fire. Having access to reliable Gust via a supporter seems like a happy medium of effectiveness and decent drawback too. Something that Creatures seems to agree with, since now we have the boss's order cards. Meaning it looks like these will stay with us for a very long time. But some people absolutely despise Lysandre, and by extension boss's orders too. Some people think that having such reliable ways to swap your opponent's active is way too strong, and this limits the effectiveness of some kind of decks, mainly evolution decks or control decks even. Some people believe that situational Gust is always best. This would include cards like Great Catcher, which would only work on EXs or GXs, Custom Catcher or Cross Switcher that would require you to play 2 at the same time, or Counter Catcher that would require you to be behind on prize cards. I'm not sure where to sit on this debate. I kinda like Lysandre and Boss's Order, although I might be a little bit biased, cause look at this full art. It's still my favourite full art support of all time. What a forceful looking card, and Lysandre for game will be burned into my brain forever at this point. So how could Lysandre somehow top these lofty heights of creating a new format staple which has been around for years afterwards? Well, fast forward a few sets to Phantom Forces and we are set to see something so ridiculous it forced Pokemon themselves to step in and fix the giant mess they've made. Phantom Forces will go down as one of the best sets in Pokemon history. It had so many good cards like the Night March Core, Mega Manectric, VS Seeker, and a whole host of Team Flare gear. And while these aren't technically Lysandre cards directly, they are related. So I think it's only fair we have a good look at them before we address the elephant in the room. So these Team Flare Hyper Gear cards were a new slight classification of trainer cards, and they all did, for the most part, pretty silly things. Like Battle Compressor for example, which just let you discard 3 cards from your deck. This is an effect we haven't quite seen before, at least in such an easy to use capacity, and it fully opened the door for some silly strategies. Night March was the biggest abuser, allowing you to pitch all your Night March Pokemon into the discard pile at a ridiculously fast rate, to make this little Joltik become one of the most format defining terrors of all time, capable of one-shotting anything and everything in its way. This would get greatly amplified when Vespiquen was released later on too. Battle Compressor would also allow you to get extremely funky with your supporter lineups, since you could discard one Lysandre, one Xerosic or Hexmaniac for example, allowing you to use them whenever you liked via VS Seeker. This led to a very non-Pokemon playstyle, something that we haven't quite seen ever again. In Expanded, cards like Mewtwo and Mew Tag Team being able to copy attacks from the discard pile meant Battle Compressor was fully broken, leading to a very explosive format indeed. Target Whistle again was a pretty unique item at the time. It would allow you to grab one of your opponent's basic Pokemon from the discard pile and pop it straight onto their bench. I was stunned when I saw this card because it seemed so mean, allowing you to target bench sitters like Jirachi EX and then force them right back into play to KO them again. And while Target Whistle didn't end up seeing a crazy amount of play, it would pop up every now and then, and whenever you could capitalise with it, it felt very strong. But if we're talking Pokemon first, then we have to look at the Team Flare tool cards. These were bright red, shiny, and they meant business. You could only attach them to your opponent's EX Pokemon, and they would effectively debuff them. Like Jamming Net would reduce the Pokemon it's attached to damage by 20, which could often be disastrous. But that's not even the worst one, because the craziest one has to be Head Ringer. It's a tool card that you would attach to your opponent's EX, and if you did, it would increase that Pokemon's attack cost by 1 colourless energy. This felt so mean and so cruel whenever you pulled it off. And again, it feels like something a little bit different than the normal Pokemon experience, as we normally don't have many ways to interact with your opponent's Pokemon outside of damage or special conditions. The only time I can think of where you could effectively attach a card to your opponent's Pokemon or mark them was Holland Tyranitar, and then these Team Flare tools, making these effects very rare. But enough of those, I know what you're really here for. Lysandre's Trump card. And this is the card where Lysandre went full crazy mode and did not care at all. Myself and the player base couldn't believe what we saw. Lysandre's Trump card just shuffled in both players' discard piles back into their decks. And I think looking back, this was meant to be a Night March counter, since you would reduce their damage back down to 0. But it turned out to be much, 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 much worse than that. You see, not only did this card 100% eliminate the deck out win condition from the game, because whenever you got down to 0 cards in deck, all you have to do is play a VS Seeker to fetch Lysandre's Trump card and shuffle everything back in again. But it also made the game completely unbalanced, since players were quick to cotton on to the most disruptive deck of all time, and Lysandre's Trump card was the beating soul of the deck. It revolved around Seismitoad EX, who would item lock your opponent with Kraken Punch. This would stop them from setting up. Meanwhile, you would bolster your 30 damage output via cards like Muscle Band and Laser Bank combo. Muscle Band would flat out boost your damage from 30 to 50, and Hypnotoxic Laser would poison your opponent's active, and 25% of the time it would leave them asleep, boosting your damage to 60 and potentially stopping them attacking. But then Verbank City Gym would boost that poison damage by another 20. This meant Kraken Punch would do an unthinkable 80 damage while item locking your opponent and sometimes leaving your opponent asleep too. But this wasn't all, since you would play a whole host of disruptive cards like Crushing Hammers and Team Flare Grunt, which would all remove your opponent's energy. This would ensure your opponent couldn't even attack you back too. And while this sounds bad, one thing you can normally do against these decks is just sit down and wait for the storm to pass, since your opponent can only play 4 Crushing Hammers or 4 Hypnotoxic Lasers, for example. So if you could just hold on until your opponent has played all them or discarded them, you could begin to mount your comeback afterwards, right? Well, that's where old mad lad Lysandre comes in, because you see, if you played VS Seeker, you could just spam all those disruptive cards, and then once you ran out, you could just play VS Seeker to grab your Lysandre's Trump card and shuffle them all back in immediately, ready to be used again. This Seismitoad deck would play Slurpuff 2, a seemingly innocent card, which would let you draw 1 extra card a turn, or 2 extra cards if the Slurpuff was in the active. So if you had 2 of these out, or 3 of these out, and a ton of switching cards, this would provide a whole ton of extra draw needed to fetch those hammers straight back from the deck and continue the onslaught. This deck fully broke the game. The format devolved into people playing disruption-based Seismitoad decks, or counter decks to that Seismitoad deck. There was no in-between. Nothing realistically could beat this Toadpuff deck reliably, and this eventually just led to everyone playing it. And it was all allowed to function solely because of this silly Lysandre card. Like, who thought this was okay? Apparently not TPCI, because eventually when they saw how bad the format was going, they were forced to step in. and they straight banned Lysandre's trump card, immediately fixing the format. Thank Arceus! But Lysandre wasn't done being an absolute mad geezer, let me tell ya. Like, how do you top getting banned? Well, it's hard, but he won't go down without a fight. The Lost Zone is the scariest place in the Pokemon TCG. Once a card enters the Lost Zone, it can never ever come back. So with that in mind, cards that can put your opponent's cards into the Lost Zone have been very, very limited. Giraffe Rig was one of the strongest. With its very funny Get Lost attack, you could put 2 cards from your opponent's discard pile into their Lost Zone. This was probably the best we've ever seen, but it did require an attack and it required you using a low HP Pokemon. And it only let you manipulate 2 cards into your opponent's Lost Zone. But here bounds Lysandre again to completely make this look silly. Lysandre Prism Star let you put 1 of your opponent's cards from the discard pile into the Lost Zone for each fire Pokemon you have in play. This potentially let you force 6 cards into your opponent's Lost Zone. This, in the right scenarios, could be downright game winning on its own. The idea of flinging 6 cards at the same time into your opponent's Lost Zone is mind boggling. Unfortunately for Lysandre, fire wasn't quite the strongest type at the time, so this card didn't see much play, apart from a singular finish in a limitless event where it was played in a Macargo Mill deck, since you would often have 2 or 3 fire types in play. But that doesn't stop this card from being downright silly. So to quickly recap, Lysandre started off a new format staple trend with Boss's Orders, and after that he got banned, and then after that he was the most aggressive way to force cards in your opponent's Lost Zone. But it doesn't even stop there for the old nutty geezer, since even his place of work was a bit silly. For most people, we just slave away in boring office blocks, right? But not Lysandre, because he went full Naughty's villain mode and invested in an underground lair. And in the games, this lair housed the Kalos legendary Pokemon, either Xerneas or Yveltal. In the TCG, however, these Lysandre Labs have a sneaky little use. You see, Lysandre Labs was a stadium card that turned off all tool cards when it was in play. Tool cards are often very strong in the Pokemon TCG, so having the ability to shut them all off on a stadium was incredibly strong. So strong, in fact, this card saw a ton of play in loads of archetypes like Pikarom, ADP, Gramble, Welderdex, Persephone, Gengar, Mimikyu Dex, Zoroark, Vikavolt, and a lot more. So even the man's gaff was incredibly unhinged. And all this makes me think, without a doubt, that Lysandre is the most unhinged man in Pokemon TCG history. And to me, it's not even close. I wonder what his next cards will do. But if you're left wondering other Pokemon TCG facts, why don't you check out this video here, where I give you 20 of the most obscure Pokemon TCG facts that you definitely don't know.